So let's move into learning disability. Let's talk a little bit about legislation. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 is really responsible for the reason why we have so many standardized tests these days. It states that by 2013, 90% of students with learning disabilities must achieve grade level proficiency. Well, that was one of the goals in any case. Opponents claim that this is unfair since students who do achieve grade level proficiency will then be removed from special education classes. However, not to be concerned because we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1975, which was revived in 2004. And when it was revised, it really highlighted that anyone who was diagnosed with a learning disability, a specific learning disability, will continue to receive services. Right? The idea is also for anyone with mental, physical, or emotional problems, as well as English language learners, and really anyone who is lacking grade proficiency in any of the areas of math, reading, or written expression. The Individuals with Disability Education Act has several regulations that apply to identifying students with learning disabilities, and specifically the idea indicated that it's up to each state to adopt criteria for identifying those children with specific learning disabilities, and that those policies need to be made public. Secondly, each state needs to identify these different criteria. So there's three criteria. One, they must not require the use of severe discrepancy between intellectual ability and achievement for determining whether someone has a specific learning disability. I'm going to read that again. Must not require the use of severe discrepancy between intellectual ability and achievement for determining whether a child has specific learning disability. When we were all going through school, what did we learn? That's right, we learned the way to diagnose if someone has a learning disability is to look at the ability achievement discrepancies. Well, IDEA came along and said that's no longer enough. And there's many reasons for that. First and foremost are English language learners who have a severe discrepancy in many of the verbal comprehension index subtests, right? You look at IQ, and then you look at maybe, say, the spelling subtest or the reading subtests of the WIAT and the RAT. And you have someone with English as a second language, maybe they show a severe discrepancy there. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a learning disability. Maybe it means that they have English as second language and they haven't learned English well enough to do well in those areas. Okay, so that's one of many reasons why we have this as something that we need to do a little bit more research in before blanketly saying someone has a learning disability. Secondly, you must permit the use of process based on child's response to scientific research-based procedures for determining whether a child has a learning disability. So that's really looking at the process behind diagnosing a learning disability. It really wants educators to go a little bit more in depth and throwing some standardized tests and coming up with some numbers that maybe not quite looking at all of the areas of someone's function. And thirdly, it says that states may permit the use of other alternative research-based procedures for determining learning disabilities. So nearly half of the students served under IDEA are classified as having a specific learning disability, whereas the others have the emotional and physical disabilities. The specific learning disability, unfortunately, is very vague. It's defined as an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. Pretty vague. And it's still described as a discrepancy in intelligence level and performance in the classroom. So not necessarily academic achievement, but how they're performing overall. Opponents of this act say that it's really poorly worded, and it now lends to over-identification and over-classification, over-representation of minorities. For example, African American students make up 15% of total population, but represent 21% of special education classes. That's a problem. Additionally, the act leaves each state up to detecting and determining how to do things, which isn't a blanket, standardized way of diagnosing learning disabilities, which has led to a lot of problems. One of the ways that legislators are trying to make changes with this comes from the 2012 proposed LEARN Act, which is Literacy Education for All, Results for the Nation. And this was really developed by Senator Patty Murray, who is proposing this act that targets schools, specifically low-income schools and schools with low literacy rates, to provide professional development programs for reading. And that's one of many. What we know. Well, we know that dropout rates for students with disabilities, learning disabilities, is approximately twice that of the general education students. What we know high school dropouts are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than their peers who graduate. That's job security for some of us, but schools and districts need to use a different wide range of tests to figure this stuff out. 1990 census showed that 89% of disabled out-of-school persons with less than a 4-year degree were at or below the 150th percent of poverty level. These are staggering statistics, but I like to throw them in to, get things moving. 1992 Office of the Inspector General's report said learning disabilities along with substance abuse is listed as one of the 2 most common impediments for welfare recipients trying to gain and maintain employment. So coming back to those of you who are interested in doing SSI evaluations, literacy is right up there, learning disabilities. And so oftentimes you'll be asked to fill out that functional assessment, and really you need to keep in mind that the person may present very well, but it might be an underlying learning disability that is preventing them from being able to succeed. And that might be what your evaluation turns into, is a really kind of a classic cognitive evaluation. U.S. Department of Education says 75% of prison inmates and 85% of juveniles in correctional facilities are functionally illiterate. I just had this slide from previous CEs, and I thought it was really cool because characteristics of the learning disabled offender: they make poor decisions, they are easily manipulated by peers, weak or missing avoidance and detection strategies, which means they're easily apprehended. They have behavior problems, which may lead to harsher treatment. And their inability to learn means that they're doomed to repeat themselves. Right? These are the revolving doors. If we can catch them early as really good evaluators and make those diagnoses of learning disabilities and really get at what's going on with this person, we can help these people. We can develop programs. We can get them into training. We can help them with forums. We can get them staff assistance. We can get them community resources, whatever, job training. We can do that. But it's really up to us as the evaluators. Learning disabilities in the prisons, well, I already talked about the 85% of juvenile offenders have reading problems. I thought that stood out. I need to say it again. And youths with learning disabilities, according to the National Center for State Courts, said they're 200 times more likely, 200% more likely to be arrested than non-disabled peers. All right, so again, these are the people that we're going to be seeing. Now, let's talk a little bit about how a disorder becomes a disorder. Well, it has to go through a validation process. For a disorder to be considered valid, it first has to have a set of criteria that don't overlap too much with other diagnoses. For instance, how many of you have heard of a central auditory processing disorder? Okay, only a handful of people. The reason it is not currently in the DSM-4, it's been around for a long time, but the reason it's not in the DSM-4 is because there's way too much overlap with ADHD. The child who has the auditory processing disorder may seem to be in their own world, may not seem to be listening, may not be attending to the situation. All of that's overlap with ADHD. And so even though this diagnosis is often given, especially in school settings by school psychologists, it isn't necessarily a recognized learning disability at this time. But just so you know, it does exist. It's a cortical level deficit in processing auditory stimuli. In essence, it's not due to hearing problems, but it does have a language, cognitive, and attentional component to it. And it's in essence, the brain is failing to extract acoustic features necessary for multimodal language and cognitive processing. So if there's too much overlap, then they're not going to have that as an actual validated diagnosis. So for a diagnosis to become a diagnosis, it has to have a validating process. All right, so recognized learning disabilities, these are the ones that Pennington highlights: speech sound disorders, language impairments, developmental coordination disorders, reading disabilities, mathematics disorders, and intellectual disability, formerly known as mental retardation, which we've already talked about. First, a little bit about neurons and dendrites. I know all of you guys remember this. The neuron is the cell in the brain that stores information. It's made of axons and dendrites increase in size and number in response to learned skills, experiences, and information. New dendrites grow as branches that allow you to learn more. However, throw out there, if someone had a very poor early childhood experience, say they weren't exposed to a lot of reading, writing, math, and perhaps they were neglected, those dendrites aren't necessarily going to branch out, and their experiences are going to be very much geared towards survival mode, as opposed to the things that are needed for learning with regard to reading, writing, math, that sort of thing. All right. So I bring up this to really kind of bring you guys back to the behavioral observations and clinical interview, because all of this is neurological. It all comes back down to the brain. Infant brain development is highly dependent on the quality of care that the infant receives. When there's inconsistent care or neglect, the infant's brain will be impaired.